by way of clarification, although I'm very glad to hear you say it, I'm actually the recipient of only one NIH grant. So someday maybe multiple, but right now only one. I'm going to go ahead and turn my camera on so you can at least all see what I look like in black and white. I'm going to turn it off in a little bit, but I kind of per Ramesh's suggestion just to put a name to the face. I've never done a presentation like this, so hopefully everything will come across great. I encourage you all to ask questions throughout the process. If you want to do that, I guess as Ramesh said, either by using the hand icon up on the screen or in the text box. I'll kind of keep an eye out on my screen to see if any questions are raised. But we're going to go ahead and get started. For now, I think Ramesh in the invitation sent out the abstract of the talk, but the overview of what we're going to talk about today is a little bit general up front with some background and introduction and history on the field of telemedicine, not so broadly, mostly focused on overview of telemedicine and speech pathology because that's clearly the topic. A little discussion of some technology considerations specific to the field, and we're going to finish up with some discussion of some of the past and current, hopefully future planned research that we're doing here at National Rehab Hospital, and kind of centered it all around the theme of what are the challenges and opportunities that face us in this field. I'm coming to you today from the National Rehab Hospital. We're in Washington, D.C. It's a freestanding inpatient acute rehab hospital, 141 beds. We have approximately 1,700 annual admissions on the inpatient side. We also have a network of over 40 outpatient facilities in primarily Virginia, Maryland. We have one site in Virginia and then several within Washington, D.C. proper. The outpatient side, we see over 200,000 visits, and the types of services NRH offers is standard inpatient, outpatient rehab, PT, OT, speech pathology, neuropsychology, vocational, cardiac. It's a very, very wide audience we do see. I want to upload one other picture here, and hopefully, if I can do this right, let's see. I have one slight change. It's uploading now. Give me a moment. Okay, here you go. Also to put things into perspective, right now we're in the middle of a tropical storm, so if for any reason my connection drops out, it's because the hospital may have flooded again and our internet connection went down, but let's keep our fingers crossed that we're doing okay. But we are right smack in the middle of that tropical storm right now, so that's where Washington is, I'm sure you all know. Let's see, we have one question. I'm going to cease the mic to okay, maybe I didn't see that correctly. I thought I had seen a hand raised. Okay. So telemedicine, we'll just jump right in, and at this point I am going to turn the video off. Telemedicine, the definition of telemedicine, there's multiple definitions. The American Telemed Association, who's kind of the main players in the field, define it as the use of medical information exchange from one site to another via electronic communications to improve patients' health status. And I know I'm somewhat preaching to the choir with a lot of the attendees here, but examples that ATA frequently gives for telemedicine: video conferencing, transmission of still images, anything related to e-health or patient portals, internet access to information. Remote monitoring of vital signs is a very large and growing component of telemedicine. They also lump in continuing medical education, opportunities such as this where clinicians and researchers can get together and share ideas, as well as nursing call centers. The main service delivery models that people always talk about, again, are hub and spoke and point to point. Hub and spoke being the most kind of frequent infrastructure in large medical settings where clients would travel to an outlying clinic and link back to a tertiary care facility for all of their encounters and consultations. Point to point is kind of more of a home-based model where patients stay in their home, school, or workplace. Services are delivered right to them. Home monitoring services could also be considered another type of service delivery. And finally, an important point to make that will come up time and again throughout this presentation is the exchange of information for telemedicine is typically either live or stored forward. In this sort of model right now, we're obviously exchanging information live. When this is available offline, clearly particularly store and forward. And store and forward is typically what's been done in fields like teledermatology, teleradiology, where high-quality, high-content information needs to be transmitted. So they'll do that through digital photography or digital radiography, upload those files later, while possibly mixing them and having a live consultation through audio and video. The last point, and this is definitely central to everything that I do and central to everything that most of the work, it's all dependent upon the technology. 5, 6, 7 years ago, a lot of what we're seeing now in the field of telemedicine wasn't possible. You have, let me see, trying to draw an arrow here on the screen. This device right here, this is the InTouch Health robot. Doctors are making actual physical rounds. They're kind of seated at home or in their office and remotely controlling this robotic device, traveling through hospitals and going bed to bed and meeting patients. The device in the middle is kind of a standard POTS video phone that would plug into any standard phone line. Some of the other devices on the right, these two over here, that one and that one, are more the home health devices. This one that I'm currently highlighting is the Health Buddy, the one on the right by Vitarian. Those are designed to transmit vital signs information or to collect static text input from patients where they're not in direct one-on-one consult with a clinician. But the bottom line here is that if we look up at that last bullet, people were calling telemedicine 15, 20 years ago when I call my patient on the phone. They may not have called it telemedicine, but that was kind of the earliest permutation of it. Then email on the internet started to take off. Now video conferencing is becoming mainstream. And as for what's next, I think it's up to the researchers to work with the clinicians to decide what technologies need to be developed. So to bring it from kind of a broader perspective down to the field that I'm working in, Telerehab is kind of the subset of telemedicine that we consider, or the field considers, the same purposes of telemedicine, but specific to the rehab realm. So speech-language therapy, occupational physical therapy, neuropsychology, cardiac rehab. And much like telemedicine, the services of Telerehab are typically assessment, intervention, remote support training of practitioners, counseling, etc. The American Telemedicine Association has a number of special interest groups, and they do have one specific to Telerehab that started 4 or 5 years ago. I'm one of the co-chairs with Janet Brown, who's the Director of Healthcare Services at ASHA, which is the American Speech-Language Hearing Association. We'll come back to them in a minute. On the bottom of the slide is the website for that SIG. It's a fairly active SIG. We have about 120 members, and we'll talk on this in a little bit. But it's a great opportunity to learn more about the field. We're trying to increase our educational opportunities. It's a bit of a challenge because unlike a field such as say teledermatology, that's very focused on one clinical field, Telerehab is very broad. There's hundreds of thousands of clinicians who potentially could practice telerehab. So it's sort of an umbrella group for now, but we are trying to hone it and build it. So when we go within telerehab, when we go back to how can we apply it in the area of speech-language pathology, in rehab, if anyone's ever had physical therapy after they've had any sort of incident from hurt your ankle playing basketball or a car crash or something more traumatic, rehab is normally thought to be very hands-on, physical therapy and occupational therapy especially. Speech therapy is, for the most part, visual and verbal. Clinicians definitely need to get their hands on patients, but for a lot of what they do, there is not a lot of direct interaction, and that's why most of the work in telerehab has been focused on speech-language pathology. Cognitive-communicative rehab that focuses on talking, thinking, reading, and writing. The typical sorts of patients that would be seen in speech pathology are patients after a stroke or a brain injury, brain aneurysms, and then as well as some developmental impairments that arise in children, such as stuttering or disfluency. And we'll talk more examples in a second. But the bottom line is that in speech, the physical distance between a clinician and client is not that much of an obstacle. And further, a lot of what clinicians do with their patients can be delivered by a computer or fax machine or any hands-off means of just exchanging information. The background in speech, the earliest work in telepractice, telerehab, telemedicine, all very related words, obviously, was about 30 years ago at the VA. And again, this began simply with telephone telephone evaluation and follow-up with patients and their caregivers. Through the years, the body of research, which is not very large, and that's one of our mandates, is to grow the body of research, shows telepractice to be feasible, effective, and appropriate for overcoming obstacles. Most frequently, the obstacles cited in the literature are much as the same as they are for other fields in telemedicine. Distance to a healthcare facility, lack of trained clinicians, or mobility impairments. Basically trying to overcome those obstacles and deliver services in a more efficient way. These topics are maybe a little bit unrelated, but I promise we'll come back full circle. ASHA's role in all of this, and this is very important to state up front, ASHA credentials all of the speech-language pathologists and audiologists in the country. Together, that's over, I think, 105,000 clinicians. They have been very, very active in promoting and supporting the work of clinicians and researchers in the field. They published a series of articles back in '97 through some of their own internal publications and have just started another series again in 2006. They had a focused initiative that was a mandated initiative within their organization from '01 to '03, where they took a look around. They had feedback from a lot of clinicians that had interest in doing this. They wanted to learn more about it. So they conducted a number of specific tasks, from formal conference presentations to holding a grant competition. They really worked with CMS to get coverage for telehealth services for speech codes, and that's an ongoing battle that we'll come back to in a little bit. They formed a working group on telepractice. This working group obviously worked very hard through the course of the last couple of years and developed a formal position statement, technical guidelines, and knowledge and skills documents. The URL on the bottom is where you can get more information on this. I'm actually going to skip this slide. Probably the most significant finding from this is that the working group came up with this statement, and this is their policy statement. It is the position of ASHA that telepractice is an appropriate model of service delivery for the profession of speech-language pathology. It offers the potential to extend services to remote, rural, and underserved populations and to culturally and linguistically diverse populations. That's a short synopsis. The position statement is quite a bit longer. There's also a position statement equivalently geared specifically toward audiology. And basically what this tells its members, if you read the whole position statement, is you are free to conduct telemedicine with your patients as long as it does not compromise the standard of care. It leaves it up to the ethical and clinical judgment of all of the clinicians, but they have not ruled it out. And beyond that, they further advocated and have really helped grow the field. So ASHA really deserves some commendation for that. So some examples of TeleSLP services. Who's doing it? What are they doing with it? There's not a tremendous amount of work going on, at least it's been reported. I actually was speaking with Janet Brown at ASHA just yesterday in preparation for this talk, and she finds out kind of through the grapevine that a lot of clinicians have taken ASHA's position statement and have been delivering services, which is great, but getting an accurate representation of who's doing what, I think we're going to hopefully work with ASHA to get another member survey out. There's a group at the University of Queensland in Brisbane, Australia, who's doing a large, great amount of work. Deborah Theodoros and a lot of her students and colleagues. They've done a lot of research and assessment of motor speech. They've done belief overman voice treatment for Parkinson's. They've done remote dysarthria evaluations. Pauline Mishima is another researcher who's been doing this for quite a while out of Tripler in Hawaii, doing a lot of offline voice therapy. VNS-NY, which is one of the, I think, the largest home health service in New York. They've been delivering home health through their speech pathologists via POTS video phones. And they're looking to upgrade their technology and hopefully grow their program. St. Alexius Medical Center, I see Bobby Hoon on the participant list. I'm glad she was able to join us today. Her group in North Dakota has been doing hub-spoke connection to some of their outpatient clinics delivering service in a very rural setting and have had great results. We'll talk about them in a minute when we get down to reimbursement issues as well, because they've had a lot of successes there. Some other examples, Integris Health has had a fairly long-standing program of providing school-based services to remote underserved areas, and that's been direct contracted to schools. Some folks have done work in accent modification, remote dysphagia evals, and modified bearing swallows, stuttering intervention, laryngectomy rehab, even AUGCOM device evaluations, which kind of gets into the assistive technology end of things, often in collaboration with occupational therapists. But this is just to give you a general feel of kind of who's doing what in the field, what the potential is. And as I said, there's a lot that's going on that we don't know about. But that's why we do encourage people to join the SIGs, to participate in ATA and other conferences like the ASHA meeting or any other meetings to kind of get the word out. Before getting into some of the technology issues, I want to speak briefly about reimbursement. Medicaid coverage, like all telemedicine, is on a state-by-state basis. And this is a very partial list. I definitely know there are more. This list was generated from a publication, I think that's now 2 or 3 years old. But normally these efforts have been, states have been persuaded to pay for, reimburse for speech telemedicine through the direct efforts of kind of some champions in the field. Some of the folks out at St. Alexius have done that, both for their local Blue Cross agencies as well as state Medicaid as well, and I believe they've had luck with all of that thus far, but not through a lack of effort, because it took quite a bit of work. Medicare, unfortunately, which is really the Medicare leads everyone follows in reimbursement, they don't currently recognize speech pathology or audiologists as approved providers. ASH has had an application in the last 2 or 3 application cycles. We're currently waiting for CMS to issue their final report, which would then go up to Capitol Hill to be legislated upon. The American Telemedicine Association has actively been involved in trying to help speech pathology as well as other professional organizations and clinical fields to get reimbursement. But it has been a bit of an uphill struggle. As I said, there are success stories. People have been able to successfully lobby payers and state Medicaid agencies. Another funding source are obviously contract services to school districts. As well, a lot of private pay clinicians are having private pay patients pay straight out of pocket. For research and funding right now, the majority of ongoing telerehab projects, and not only in speech but telerehab in general, are funded right now as R&D activities, and that's because reimbursement is so scarce. It's good to see that funding agencies such as OAT and the Department of Education still value and recognize the merit of telerehab and are supporting the work. And we're hoping that the findings of these research projects, both in terms of outcomes data, technology development, et cetera, will really allow clinicians to hit the ground running when reimbursement does, when the reimbursement hurdles go away and projects and programs can hopefully become self-sustaining. As for licensure, clearly it's a major issue for all professions providing any sorts of telehealth services. The nursing compact model, the interstate nursing compact model is, I think, where all professions would love to head, where one licensure gets you licensed in all 50 states regardless of state lines. Even with the nursing compact model, it's not fully accepted in all the states, and I know ASHA, for one, isn't really ready to begin that process of trying to go that way, and there's a lot of, I think, internal politics within all professional organizations, not just speech, that might stand in the way of that. But the bottom line, as far as ASHA is concerned, is you must be licensed wherever the patient lives that you're treating or if the patient receives services. And that's kind of been the bottom line for speech as well as other clinical applications. I will go on next to some technology considerations, and these are some lessons learned and things that we've picked up from our own work, but I think there's just a lot of general human factors guidelines that should definitely be considered. Before talking about some of our own work in which we've developed our own technology, I'm sure everyone in this room has probably used telemedicine or video conferencing in some degree, and you'll all agree that a lot of video conferencing features are, there's a lot of bells and whistles to video conferencing features, but dependent upon who makes the device, just having those bells and whistles don't always make that device appropriate. The biggest considerations from going from a kind of commercial video conferencing or distance learning environment to one that would be used clinically is its clinical functionality. Are there issues with usability, learnability, error tolerance, et cetera, that will stand in the way of clinicians as well as patients using it? And central to all of this is the recognition that users of all of these devices aren't just the telemedicine technical staff or the IT staff. They're not always available to set up a call. Clinicians often have to modify settings on the fly. There's caregivers involved, and that's in kind of a corporate hub-spoke model. Some of the things that we're developing are designed to be used directly by clients. potentially, ideally in the long term, placed into their homes. So, you know, we always kind of use the barking dog scenario that, or you know, mailman at the door. There's a lot that goes on in someone's home. So there's the usability of, if it's a computer-based system, the usability of the software itself, the usability of the computer itself, the distractions in the environment, like the barking dogs or the mailman at the door. These systems need to really be capable of handling all of those different aspects. The weaknesses of technology, and I just hinted on this, traditional video conferencing is somewhat limiting. The features and capability that go beyond visual and verbal interaction really aren't that intuitive. They're not easy to use, and they're really not flexible. If it's a document camera, oftentimes and you want to share a piece of paper, physical object, or a piece of paper with a client, it requires you to switch the video source, make sure things are focused and zoomed correctly. It doesn't really allow you a lot of flexibility. If it's a computer-based video conferencing system, if you want to use something to share a piece of paper, the piece of paper needs to be scanned in. You need to make sure that it's shared properly. There's really no one-button access. And for devices that are to be used specifically and directly by clients and caregivers, that's definitely a problem. By way of examples here, I just took 2 screenshots I grabbed off the internet. The one on the right is Polycom's PBX software, which is a relatively low cost and for the cost, a great piece of a great tool for video conferencing, and it does have data sharing. You know, it's got excellent audio and video, but some of the data sharing tools are kind of accessed through a drop-down toolbar sort of interface, and then you have to switch through a couple of different tabs. And it's a great, powerful tool, but it's really not designed for clinical functionality in our view. Similarly, this software on the left by VCon called VPoint is, again, very powerful, but it's not really ideal for what we want. The functionality really gets lost behind menus and toolbars, and that's not appropriate and really problematic in a lot of situations. Again, for more room-based systems, for folks that aren't using computer-based systems, remote controls. You know, this may not look more complex than a television remote, but still, I think there are some ways we can make things simpler, and that's very important for all of us to remember. The goal of all of our technology in Telerehab or in speech or tele-PT, tele-RT, the technology must not only facilitate, but ideally enhance and expand client and clinician interaction. The first thing that all of our clinicians say in a rehab environment, and I think maybe more so in a rehab environment, but it's appropriate to all telemedicine, a lot of clinicians feel that there's a lack of physical bonds between a clinician and a client. In a rehab setting where patients typically have come through some sort of traumatic event to get to the hospital, they're going through a lot of life changes, and clinicians become mentors, they become friends, they become peers, and the face-to-face interaction, there's a lot of bonding that goes on between patient and caregivers and clinicians. And a lot of clinicians are initially perhaps hesitant to say, well, when I'm removed from that, how do I form that bond? And really the goal of technology is to enable that bond, to promote it, and hopefully in some ways maybe even make it a little bit stronger in terms of delivering some clinical tools. So with that, I'm going to jump into, I see no hands raised, so I'm hoping everybody's following along. Some of the past research we did in this field was driven by the motivation of kind of looking at the literature in the field and saying, well, speech pathology is ideally suited. We've talked about that before or earlier. There's a lack of research in the field, but we know it can be done. The little research that has been done is valid, so let's maybe expand upon it. So we picked a standardized validated SLP evaluation, one that hadn't been done before, and we administered in both face-to-face and telerehab settings. And our main questions were not only does performance differ, but we wanted to see if, looking at our subjects, does technology experience, level of education, age, gender, and site of brain injury, does that influence performance? And our thought was, if we could expose some exclusionary factors and say, you know what, in order to use this, and one of the hypotheses of us and many others was, in order to use technology, you maybe need to have a certain level of computer experience or a certain level of education. And So this was kind of exploratory to help us plan future research. So we saw 40 patients, 14 both right side stroke, 14 left side stroke, and 12 traumatic brain injury. Pretty even distribution of male and female. Our age range meaned around 44.4, and we had, I think the majority of our patients probably above 30, and that was due to, I think, we wanted to get both stroke and TBI patients. So the first question, does performance differ? And I won't go into all of the details. We have a few publications on this if you're interested in hearing all of the nuts and bolts. But the measure on this score was, as you can see over here, was the mean percent IU, percent information unit. And what happened in the methodology, subjects were seated in a face-to-face setting, and then they were exposed randomized order to a Telerehab setting. And stories were played back for them that were supported by pictures. Short stories about 1 minute, and the subjects basically had to retell the stories. During the face-to-face administration, the stories were presented on paper, held up on an easel in front of them. During the computer administration, on the screen was the video of the clinician and the stories as well, and that's how they popped up. So I know it may be a little tough to visualize, but the bottom line is that there was no statistically significant difference between settings, and this was kind of comparable with the majority of the literature in the field. But for us, what was more interesting is that for our second question, we found no significant differences at all in performance between the Telerehab and the face-to-face settings, based on any of our 4 variables. From this, we found that there were no gross exclusionary factors for administering Telerehab to brain-injured subjects. Now, clearly, there was a lot of lessons learned in terms of, we knew we needed to, in our selection criteria, control for level of attention. But in terms of age, in terms of technology experience, there was no difference at all. There was actually a not significant, but there was definitely a trend towards significance in that the patients who had the least amount of technology experience actually performed slightly better in the Telerehab setting. We think some of this may have been due to a bit of novelty. They weren't aware at all of the fact that you could even do this. A lot of our patients were older patients who had never even been in front of a computer, and to suddenly see the face of a clinician, I think there was a lot of motivation to perhaps perform a little bit better, but that's all a little subjective. But the bottom line from these, and then finally on our satisfaction survey, somewhat not surprisingly, we found that the overwhelming response was that yes, they would like to talk to a clinician again by video conferencing. So the bottom line from this is we looked at our studies and our study and our other studies in the field, and we said, well, everybody's thus far looked at assessments or evaluations that are done, collect a score in face-to-face, collect a score in Telerehab, compare the scores. No one's really looked at treatment interventions. When we think about telemedicine, when we talk about it improves access to care, it cuts down on transportation costs, treatment for a lot of patients after a stroke or a brain injury may go on for 6 or 8 weeks. Depending on funding, maybe longer. Unfortunately, with funding the way it is now, it's oftentimes much shorter. But in terms of saving transportation costs and decreasing missed appointments, those benefits of Telerehab are really realized when we look at the treatment phase and not the assessment phase. The assessment typically happens at intake evaluation and discharge evaluation. But what happens during those 8 weeks? Can we get adequate results? So our hypothesis as to why no one really looked at treatment interventions is because of the equipment. A lot of what patients do and clinicians do isn't capable with just regular video conferencing. Even the use of something like a document camera to get another form of interaction is a little bit problematic with current equipment. And usability was not really ideal for this setting. So looking at face-to-face rehab interaction and watching a lot of sessions and seeing how patients interact with clinicians, at least in the realm of speech, there's verbal and visual communication, and that clearly happens anywhere from the hallway to a patient's bedside to an outpatient treatment room. But in speech, there's also what we kind of termed a treatment workspace, and this, more often than not, is actually a tabletop. And on this tabletop, clinicians will use flashcards, they'll use workbooks, they'll use physical objects, they'll use picture cards, all sorts of materials that are used, interacted together on this treatment workspace. So the model that we proposed for Telerehab interaction was how do we with TeleSLP, how do we deliver that same sort of interaction? So verbal and visual communication we can do off the bat with video conferencing, and we know we can do that with modern technology at very high quality at relatively low cost, and that's a huge advantage of being able to leverage modern technology. But on this treatment workspace, everything then has to be digital. So pages get scanned, pictures get scanned, software that you normally would write on with a pen, maybe we can use digital ink. So we were trying to be creative about how we can go about trying to deliver this same sort of interaction. So with that, that takes us to the next study that we've just recently wrapped up, and then some of our plans for the future. So this study investigated the role of interactive data sharing, the same concept of a treatment workspace. How do we deliver interaction through this treatment workspace, and what are its clinical implications? So the objective of the study was to evaluate functional communication changes that occur through Telerehab, but also how do clients and clinicians interact. The target population, again, was adults with neurogenic impairment following left to right stroke, as well as TBI, less than 2 years post-onset. We did this as a case study design. We ended up seeing 5 patients. The target for each patient was 18 total sessions. 2 were face-to-face evaluation initially, including technology training, followed by 15 TeleSLP sessions and 1 face-to-face discharge session. During the treatment sessions, the clinician and clients for the first 4 case studies were seen inside the hospital in 2 separate rooms. They had no interaction at all during this phase. The clinician was in an entirely separate portion of the hospital. They would check in. They would never see the clinician. If there was a technology problem that arose, myself or one of the other research assistants would go in and reboot the computer, walk them through fixing the fax machine, anything that needed to be done. So we really tried to maintain distance as best we could. The final case study was done at home, and I'll talk about those, the data from that a little bit later. So here was our study sample. Ages were about 37 was our youngest. They all actually ended up as a convenient sample. Unfortunately, they all ended up being less TBAs, but we actually think that's a very good target population that has probably the most potential. The technology experience of patients ranged from 0, as in never having used a computer, up to advanced, 2 participants who've used video conferencing extensively at work. One was an attorney who had worked, in the federal government and had a lot of experience to high-end technology. These technology experience ratings came from a custom survey that we developed. Unfortunately, it's not evaluated or published, but the technology experience accounts for the amount of experience you have in the past, your current pre-injury usage of computers, as well as the types of applications you use on the computer. Is it just surfing the internet? Is it something more advanced or interactive like playing games or using video conferencing or sharing pictures or interactive messaging? And clinically, what our clinicians were most frequently treating were praxia and aphasia. So back to the technology, what we developed was a system called RESPECT. The acronym stands for Remote Speech-Language Cognitive Treatment. It's a multifunctional platform that combines video conferencing with a virtual desktop. I'll talk about that in 1 second. And that virtual desktop allows us to do all sorts of different interactive data sharing, from shared documents, scanned pages from workbooks. We can share computer applications or whiteboards. A lot of basically what we can do on this Illuminate software as well. So we use video conferencing. The software we used was from Polycom. It was their prior to PBX software called Via Video, which was an H323 IP-based system. It had hands-free echo cancellation audio. The data conferencing was accomplished through NetMeeting. And from the user interface perspective, what was somewhat unique is that the clinician controlled all aspects of the system. The client did not have to have their hands on the mouse or the keyboard. Anytime the screen on the client's end needed to change, if the windows were resized, if a file was opened, the clinician did all of that from her side of the call, which was a very nice feature in terms of usability. So we'll talk about clinical outcomes in a minute, but what this graphic basically shows is the the amount of time that clients and clinicians interacted. Actually, I guess this last column is probably the most important. What this basically does is take all of our session time and subtracts out time when software was dropped, or calls were dropped, software crashed, etc. For the first 4 patients where we treated them within the controlled environment of the hospital, we had very high interaction, and probably equivalent to the % interaction that you would get when you subtract the times when a clinician has to answer a page or step out of the room for a minute to speak to a colleague. So we were very happy with that. The home-based patient was sufficiently worse for a lot of technology reasons that we did not identify until we did the case study. So we looked at client-clinician interaction. We tried to break it down and say, how are people using this technology? So the first comparison we looked at was how much time was spent in audio-visual only, where the only interaction a patient and a client has is just verbal and visual. There's no data shared at all. And then the second part we looked at was how are they using this shared data, and then we'll break that down further. But looking at that kind of raw data, from this graph, the green proportion represents the percentage of calls for each of the case studies that was spent in audiovisual plus data, the red being purely audiovisual. The deviation is, since these were case studies, it's tough to make across-the-board conclusions, and I definitely should have prefaced all of this with that up front, so I'm not making any real generalizable findings at this point. But it's important to note that, for the majority of patients, more than 60% of the time was spent using data sharing. Case study 2, the majority of, a lot of the treatment they were doing did not really require data sharing. It was a lot of just basic conversational communication. So that's kind of the description of that. So percentage-wise, across all of our sessions and all 4 of our subjects, almost 80% of the time was spent in AV plus data sharing, which is a very interesting finding. But now what we wanted to do is say, well, what were you doing in that 80% of the time? How were you utilizing data sharing clinically? What were the implications? So there were 4 modes we looked at. The first was, and you can see in this picture, this is the clinician's view, clinician's over here. This is the video of the client. Here's your webcam on top of the screen. Over here, this is a shared Microsoft Word page that the clinician would open up as a blank page and frequently kind of closed caption conversation, work on reinforcement of drill and practice, keep a conversation on track. A client had a kind of a record of what they were talking about if they did get confused. What was nice, since it was just basic Word, as you can see, she highlighted a sentence here to change the contrast. The clinician could change font size. She can embed images. She could pretty much do anything she wanted. This was a blank canvas. The second data sharing mode was SLP material. These were pages that were scanned from existing workbooks that our clinicians are most familiar with. This is a client's view. You see, they see just simply the video of the clinician and the shared data. That's it. No other complexity on the screen. Third data sharing mode was SLP software, and this is some custom software we wrote, drill and practice software, where the client can respond on the screen, gets instantaneous feedback. And a lot of these, the client was working supervised, but pretty much on their own, where the clinician would just be watching the performance and providing feedback as necessary. And the fourth was whiteboard. In this case, we use a whiteboard for a barrier drawing task, but the whiteboard, similar to Microsoft Word, could be used for the clinician to do anything she wanted and gain any response. It's also worth mentioning that obviously in all of these data sharing modes, the data is truly interactive in real time. So everything the client does on his or her screen, the clinician sees, and vice versa, which is a very powerful tool with little or no delay. So when we look at the data sharing results, the across the board, and this is case study 1, I guess there's a lot of data on this slide, but the most important thing to look at is that we had a total of 56 sessions, and our clinician used this MS Word, kind of the ability to just do things on the fly. For pretty much every session, just one session she didn't use it for. The SLP material, again, was kind of the second highest in frequency, followed by Shared Internet Explorer, the speech software, and the whiteboard. Now, again, it's tough to draw hard conclusions from this because patients had different clinical goals. But for the most part, our clinician found that the ability to tailor things on the fly and to use that Microsoft Word page any way that she chose was really the most powerful. An example of this, case study 2, where she completed 11 sessions. She moved from the area, unfortunately, and we weren't able to complete. She used in 8 of 11 sessions to use the SLP material, and again, given some of her clinical goals at the time, she was doing a lot of apraxia drills on the computer through that drill and practice software. It is worth mentioning that a very powerful unintended use of the ability to share programs, our clinician used Internet Explorer a number of times. We had our case study 3 patient was pretty severely apraxic and was really working on her pronunciation. And one of her homework tasks every day was to bring their daily topic. And one of the things they talked about was she knitted. She knitted and crocheted, and our clinician didn't. So she kept trying to get a word out during a conversation, and the clinician just wasn't getting it. So she was able to open up an Internet Explorer browser and Google this word, and sure enough, it was a type of yarn. And that's kind of one of those things that our clinician pointed to and said, that's something, if I was in a face-to-face session with her, we don't have computers in our treatment room, I would have no idea what she was talking about. So it's kind of a minor example, but it does really show you how the ability to have these tools right at your discretion is a very, very, very powerful feature. I'll talk quickly about some of the at-home findings we found. The equipment installation was quite a struggle. This patient lived about 25 miles from the hospital, had an existing Verizon DSL line into her home. However, for our system to work, we needed to install a new router, work with Verizon to get a static IP address assigned. It was a little problematic. So in the next version of the software we're developing, we're kind of from the ground up designing it to be appropriate. I do see Ramesh has a question.
I was actually smiling at the difficulty of setting these things up, so it was not the question, actually.
Okay, sorry, I mistook a smile for a hand. Thank you for that statement. It was quite a bit of a problem. We were fortunate, as we've been with really all of our case studies, to have incredibly tolerant and patient clients and participants in all of our research subjects. They've just been, I think, so happy to be involved in research that they see immediate benefit from once this is launched and kind of becomes the standard of care. So the benefit for them, we actually were seeing them right around the time gas prices spiked. So, the patient's husband was ecstatic that he didn't have to drive 50 miles round trip. And I know for a lot of the folks on this call, the fact that a patient has to drive 50 miles round trip probably makes you laugh because, given some of the rural locations you're dialing in from, but transportation is a problem for patients really regardless where they are, rural or urban. And Washington, D.C., I think we now have the second worst commute in the country. So I think just as we're rural, or just as we're not rural, we definitely have the same issues. So the outcomes from this clinically, we're still doing all of our pre- and post-test comparisons, but participants did achieve improvement in their functional communication toward their individual treatment goals that were consistent with what our clinician expected. Satisfaction very high. They felt like they were more involved. They thought it was novel, exciting, and fun. Again, we found that prior technology experience was not a factor. Related to case number 5, it was actually interesting. This was a woman she was a nurse. She had a very high level of education, but didn't really use the computer for much. And perhaps one of the downsides of our system is that whenever we had problems, we would need to close the software, restart the computer, sometimes reboot the modem. This is a woman who was several months past stroke, past a left-side stroke. And when we went to pick up the equipment, she felt like she knew so much more about computers because she could restart Windows very, very well. And if not, do a hard reboot and hold the power button in. So kind of an unintended consequence, but interesting to note nonetheless. As for data sharing, and this really brings us to what we're hoping to do in the next phase of our work, data sharing we found to be appropriate, powerful, and flexible for enhancing interaction. We had a stock library of treatment material that our clinician was able to use during sessions. On several occasions, we were actually able to tailor the material. We had a patient who would email photos of what he was doing, at home or on the weekends or trips he took, the clinician would be able to load them into a Word document and bring those up as discussion material during the next session. So that was kind of a neat use of interactive technology. As for data sharing, doing everything on the computer is much less cumbersome than document cameras and fax machines, and it doesn't require a document camera at either end to get instantaneous response or to work on something interactively. Again, the ability to dynamically modify the material was very powerful, as well as providing real-time feedback on performance. It really enabled the clinician to feel like she was sitting next to a patient and she could, pick her pen up and instantaneously mark or highlight or draw attention to something on a physical piece of paper that she would do in a face-to-face setting. So that was very powerful. So as we run up on 10 to 1, I told Ramesh I'd keep this right about an hour, and believe it or not, I'm pretty right on schedule, and I'd like to have some questions at the end. Moving beyond this work, we have a study right now, the NIH study that Ramesh alluded to, is a 2-year R21 project, where we're basically looking to enhance and improve greatly, and then do some usability evaluations on that ReSPECT software system. We had an advisory board meeting last week. They gave us some great input on some clinical implications and both client implications as well for software design. And we're about a third of the way through designing the software, and then we'll be doing a couple phases of usability evals with actual novice clinicians and clients here at the hospital. So we're looking forward to that. And then beyond that, looking to really do some controlled research studies. But the challenges that face us in telemedicine, regardless of the technology, is that there is the inability to use tactile cues. And folks in the physical therapy realm have talked about this for a while, and, can we integrate robotics and haptics? And yes, you can. In a research environment, I think that's very feasible in the short term. I don't think it's realistic in a deployable clinical situation, unfortunately. There's also the possibility of missing the human element. And that ties into the fourth third of a limited point of view. Our current system had one camera mounted on top of the screen. If I was to turn my camera on again, for everyone who was here at the start of the call, you would see me. But you don't know if there's someone sitting behind the camera making faces at me, or someone seated off the side of the screen giving me answers. We had a lot of patients who, when they came to the hospital, wanted to bring a family member with them into the room. But, for example, one patient's mother kept giving her the answers to all of her picture identification tasks, and this was a woman who we were doing some aphasia drills with. So having the limited point of view kind of is difficult, and we are definitely looking at different camera options for us to expand for our new software. And then clearly, as Ramesh, I'm sure, agrees, equipment installation and maintenance is definitely a challenge, especially in a home situation where there is limited IT staff for both installation and troubleshooting. But some of the opportunities, and these are substantial opportunities, we know we have adequate video and audio quality. Even using something like this, something like MSN Messenger that's off the shelf is very good quality. You can communicate multimodally through video, audio, and now interactive data. Through our work and others, we've got very high satisfaction and very active participation. Clearly, like all telemedicine, it allows you to expand the reach of clinicians as well as the availability of services. The continued growth of broadband internet. This is more so than anything, I think, going to really drive telemedicine, especially in home applications. Cable, DSL, now even fiber, satellite communications, these are getting cheaper. These are getting easier to install, hopefully more tolerant of using applications like video conferencing. Right now, there's oftentimes a requirement to have a static IP address on a computer. That's problematic. The last two bullets are kind of interesting, and the people are becoming more aware of video conferencing. For a while, and I don't know if you still could, Amazon or Best Buy, you could buy POTS video phones that plug into regular phone lines, and they were becoming more mass market. Things like MSN Messenger, even things like YouTube online. People are doing more and more things with video. Now, not really all related to medical application, but people are they're growing to expect it. And as our society ages and the number of people who are doing more high-tech things with computer ages, medical consumers are really they have an existing expectation of technology and e-health. Everybody pretty much knows what HIPAA is, if not what it stands for, what it means. My medical information is private. But if you if you're searching out a doctor or a hospital to give birth to your child, a lot of times now people are going to say, well, what technology do you have access to? We were on a tour of the maternity wing where my wife and I are expecting a child in the near future and where we'll deliver. And at least one or two people ask the nurse separate questions of, do you have wireless internet? Can I upload my pictures from the room? So as far as medical technology and healthcare technology, they're really embedded, and I think people will look to hopefully drive their payers to call up their Blue Cross and not only have the clinicians advocating, but the patients advocating and saying, why can't I use this to talk to my provider? That's just, that's unfortunate. You need to change that. These are two graphics I found from the FCC, and I'm not sure how accurate they are, but they basically show broadband providers in 2000 and 2004, and without looking at the fine print, you can clearly see there's a wider dispersal. Folks in rural areas will definitely agree and speak to the point that, yeah, well, we still use POTS for the most part when we go to patients' homes because they're not there. But in terms of connecting medical clinics and outpatient centers, there is broadband typically available in most spots. Just two more slides to wrap up. Research and funding, clearly funding opportunities are increasing. NIH has had a few solicitations specifically to telemedicine. I was funded through a grant through NIBIB, Institute on Biomedical Imaging and Bioengineering. Robert Wood Johnson has a current call for proposals out for online medical access that isn't necessarily interactive from a pure telemedicine stance, but it's related. The Office of Advancement of Telehealth, Rural Universal Services, National Library of Medicine. These are all organizations that have or will hopefully continue to fund telemedicine projects. And ultimately, all of the research data is going to help drive the adoption and ideally reimbursement of Telerehab. So, as researchers, it's really our task to collect the data, to mandate for change, and when that data is collected, be ready to hit the ground running and to start delivering clinical services. As for future directions, we need to increase our research and publications, especially looking at outcomes in comparison to face-to-face, advocate and support legislation to include, in the case of my work, speech pathology and audiology as reimbursable telehealth services. Maintaining quality standards. The American Telemed Association has a large standards and practice group that is looking at this. They have some standards already in place for a few medical applications. Diabetic retinopathy is one they've worked on. Now they're working on one for home care, as well as equipment protocols. We need to make sure all of our devices talk to each other and do it well and seamlessly. And finally, emphasize human factors in the design of all of our systems. This will ultimately not only increase acceptance and utilization of the technology, but also satisfaction with the technology. And that's really the bottom line of getting devices into the hands of consumers and clients, or clinicians and clients, who are going to use them and enjoy them and get clinical benefit from them. So the final slide is just my contact information. Within National Rehab, I'm located at the Center for Applied Biomechanics and Rehab Research. Have some of the information on this and other work on our website. There were a few other URLs on the slide that may be of interest to you, but at least for now, I just want to thank you for your time, and I'll turn my microphone off and open it up to any questions.
Okay, while I'm waiting for others to think about the questions and maybe type in, and type the questions in the text box in the direct messaging window. I had one question regarding, I think you mentioned that prior technology exposure was not a factor in determining, to what extent people were satisfied with the system. I was wondering, do you think this might be the case because there was a strong involvement of the technical backup team that was involved, and the very presence of the technical person in the house, setting everything up, that actually reduced any kind of feelings that they might have against the technology?
That's a really good point, Ramesh. And in these case studies, as well as the first study, I don't think any of our clinicians ever had, any of our clients ever had the thought of flying solo. We never dropped a piece of equipment off at their door and said, here are the installation instructions, good luck. They knew if there was a problem during a session, they could call my office and I'd be right there. But I think and unfortunately I didn't have time or the opportunity to present all of the satisfaction information on the screen, but we did ask them questions related to, did you feel that the audio quality was adequate? Did you feel that the being able to only see one view of the clinician got in the way? And those were sort of the issues where people really didn't have a problem. No one ran, from the study in the middle of it saying, I don't like this. Now, granted, it was a convenient sample, so clearly people took the time to read the consent form and be explained about recruitment, and they chose to participate, so they knew what they were getting into. So in some respects, the satisfaction data is a little misleading, but if you do look at some of the human factors data on technology use and acceptance, not only in telemedicine, but just in general informatics or computer science research, things like age definitely don't play a role. It's normally prior technology experience. So it's an issue we definitely need to look at. But at least for now, we haven't identified any major hurdles. I'll move to, I see a text question from Sarah. What are the risks to client privacy, HIPAA, in transmitting video feed by the internet? That's a very, very good question. Somewhat of a moving target. The video conferencing vendors have a few different standards. I believe right now, and unfortunately I need to really, it's one of the aspects of the new system we're developing for the NIH grant, and it's something we need to really solve now. But the standard is AES, I think it's the Advanced Encryption System or Service, and that tends to be, it's a specification of the specific device that you're using. In the past, I believe the Polycom system we did allow for that. If you are also obviously submitting through something like a VPN, virtual private network, or secure network transmission, in our case, when we were within the hospital firewall, we had no problem with that. But that's a very, very big issue that's being addressed not only in the area of Telerehab, but a lot of telemedicine as a whole. As applications like voice over IP and Vonage and Skype and services like that become a little more mainstream, the issues of privacy will be definitely brought to the forefront, and industry will hopefully be able to define standards that are in collaboration with the telemedicine population. So I hope that answers your question.
Are there any more questions? Well, if you do, just type the question in the direct messaging window. I just wait for a few minutes, and if you don't have any questions, I think we've reached our hour, and I will close the session. This session has been recorded, and it will be archived. And if you look at the invite that we sent, you'll find that there is a link to the archives, and feel free to redistribute, and post the information to colleagues and friends. And as I said, we are always looking for speakers. So if any one of you is willing to present on any topic that's relevant to telemedicine, rural health, get in touch with me. I take this opportunity again to thank Dave Brennan, who has given us an excellent talk today, and I hope to see you, maybe on a different occasion sometime in the future. All right, thanks, Dave, for taking the time to give us this great talk. Thank you.
It was my pleasure. Thanks again for inviting me. And I think those are hands clapping. I'm not quite sure. I guess that's the Illuminate way to tell me that I did a good job. So I'm glad you all enjoyed the talk. Feel free to contact me offline if you have any questions, want more information, really anything. I'm very open to any and all suggestions on our work, and encourage you all to continue in your efforts. I know you've done some great work. So hopefully we'll see you all very soon.